Okay, hopefully the sound works this time and I won't have to do this for the fourth time. Modern liberalism and modern conservative is the point of this presentation. If you looked at it and you understand it, you don't have to listen to the audio. I like to think that my audio helps, but maybe it doesn't. Your judgment, you make that call. What we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to look at the similarities between the classical notions of liberal and conservative and the modern notion. See where they are similar, why they're both called liberalism or conservatism, but also look at the difference, why they're called modern and classical. And then to try to figure out how common they are out there in the world, both in the United States and the world as a whole. So the first thing we're doing here now is looking at from classical to modern liberalism. Classical liberalism, as you should know by now, focuses on the idea of the need for government, but the need for government that promotes liberty and freedom of the individual. And the reason is that the whole idea of government is considered to be a necessary evil, that the individual is best when left alone and free to pursue whatever it is they want. Uh, but you need some kind of referee, and that's what government is all about. And so the way to achieve liberty, you set up a government whose sole purpose is to achieve and maximize liberty while also protecting people from others who may want to do them harm or who may want to manipulate them or be fraudulent. So there are clear rules. You design the government in a way that limits it, and you see that in the United States by the separation of powers and the checks and balances. You also see it in the relationship between national and state government called federalism. So those are structural designs that are essentially meant to almost guarantee limited government. And then you also protect the minorities, particularly those minorities that have something other people want. Economic minorities, meaning wealthier people, property owners, business owners. You protect them from majority will. And if you remember back to the Hudson reading, that's often called protective democracy. Um, so this whole notion in classical liberalism of government is one of what we call negative government. That government, which governs best, governs least. The idea that government's only there because it has to be, but that we have to design it so that it leaves us alone almost all the time. So let's talk about modern liberal. And you did the readings, hopefully, and I know they're probably now long in your memory. But the FDR quote that is in the start of the reading is the first quote that you see there. It's frequently been said that eternal vigilance is necessary to preserve our liberties. That is a classical liberal notion that you need to preserve liberties and you need to be vigilant. Well, what Roosevelt argued in 1941 is it's, quote, equally true that eternal vigilance is necessary to keep democracies and their governments truly liberal. And what he meant by that was that sometimes you need sort of vigilance in favor of government to protect liberalism for everybody instead of the privileged few. And so let's go into that and now look at modern liberal presumptions as opposed to the classical liberal. Number one, freedom is still the center of concern. That's what makes it liberal, that freedom is still the main goal. But it focuses on everyone being free, not an individual hypothetically being free, which is what classical liberalism is all about. That we basically assume everybody should be free and that things will be fine. So the third bullet is that the inequality in the economic markets that we see in modern times, with the creation of corporations and and the means of production being standardized and mass production and interchangeable parts, all those sorts of things, has created the accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a few to the threat of the many. And so, economic inequality is something that will inhibit freedom for many of us, most of us, and as a result, government needs to step in to be a counterweight or to soften the edges of free market capitalism. So again, modern liberalism is a capitalist approach to government, but it's one that says the government now has a positive role. So we have this notion of modern liberalism and positive government. That government can actually increase our freedoms through its activity. And it does so primarily to protect the average person from the ill effects of sort of free market capitalism in the modern industrial era. So the role of government is intervene so that you can level the playing field so that everybody has an equal chance. It's often called equal opportunity. One of the things you have to do is to prevent monopolistic practices. If somebody owns or controls the entire segment of a market, they basically call the shots, and that's anti-democratic in the idea of modern liberalism. The other thing that's really important, and I mentioned this in the last presentation, is that you use government to sort of help prevent these boom and bust periods where there's enormous wealth that builds up and then this massive crash where people lose all their money. That government, through regulation, can smooth that out. And in doing so, ensure a base of security, economic security, primarily in the sort of FDR liberal version, a sort of economic base for all citizens, retired citizens, poor citizens, but also middle class people, and later, for example, people who wanted to go to college but didn't have the wherewithal to pay the full tuition. So government has a positive role. It can create laws, it can intervene in the market, it can regulate markets, and it can redistribute income to promote freedom for a greater number of people. One of the things you didn't read, but that took place a few months before the speech that you read, is the Four Freedoms speech that FDR gave in 1941 in the State of the Union address, which took place in January. And if you look at those four freedoms, speech, worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, you see the first two are just deeply classical liberal. Freedom of speech, the right of an individual to discern what truth is, express that concern, and to promote that concern, and to petition government. The freedom to worship. He had noted that sort of the rise of fascism, particularly at the time, and communism to some degree, but really it was fascism at that point in time, basically oppressed people on the basis of what they believed, and he felt that we had to reassert that in the world. And then freedom from want and fear are economic freedoms. Freedom from not being able to feed yourself or your children or your family. Freedom from fear, meaning the freedom from worrying about whether or not you're going to be able to shelter or clothe or have a job and support your family. And so these four freedoms, the first two are classical liberal, first two are modern liberal. So the key distinctions between classical and modern liberals focuses on the meaning of freedom, first of all. Classical liberals basically says negative government, you basically freedom from, and that's what the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, freedom from government intervention into speech, assembly, worship, the establishment of religion, the Second Amendment, guns, freedom to possess firearms, that's a complex issue. The quartering of troops in people's houses without their permission, the right of people who encounter law enforcement, often called sort of the rights of the accused, the right against cruel and unusual punishment, the right against all of those things. These are examples of freedom from. The modern liberal expands freedom from and comes up with the argument that we should actually help people have freedom to do things. And so, that's the difference, that if we make sure that senior citizens who are, more likely to be in poverty in 1932 than they were to not be in poverty in 1932, the right of them to know that they could actually afford to survive. That's a freedom too. The right to pursue a higher higher education, the right to pursue job training, or the right to pursue a business, a small business. These are all freedoms too, and the modern notion says government can actually help you on that. The second distinction is the source of the problem in these views of liberalism. Traditionally, classical liberalism saw governmental power, the king and parliament, when we're talking about breaking away from Great Britain, but basically whoever had governmental power was the source of oppression. In modern liberalism, the presumption is that private interests can have as much oppressive force as government, particularly sort of large corporations and companies that exploit workers. The third biggest difference, again, I mentioned, is the difference in the role of government in dealing with individuals. Classical liberalism says, hey, government minimal. Modern liberalism said, nope, positive. Government can be actually fairly large. So if we go back to this typology from the political compass, what I've done is I've taken the image and I have put into it sort of where FDR's New Deal and the 1920 policies might fit in the continuum. And you see that FDR is kind of toward the center, a little on the left on the economic scale, or maybe a little bit into the quadrant on the authoritarian left, but still deeply capitalistic in its orientation toward government, just a little less so than the policies of the 1920s, which you see is a little further to the right, which means a little less government intervention on economics, and a little higher up on social scale, meaning regulating morality, for example, prohibition. So again, you see in the grand scheme of the world notion of ideologies, not that much of a difference, but it is different. Now let's go now to conservatism. And I'm going to do the same thing, from classical conservatism to modern conservatism. Classical conservatism in Great Britain, it's often called Toryism. So when you hear the Tories, that's the Conservative Party in Great Britain, which is the party that currently holds power. Margaret Thatcher was the leader of the revolution that led to Conservatives being in control for a generation. The goal of Toryism is order. Remember, conservatism comes from Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was afraid of the French Revolution, and he thought that you need to protect the order of society first and foremost. In these assumptions, and a lot of conservatives don't understand this, is that classical conservatism says self-interest is ultimately harmful to society, and so you have to restrain it. So people will pursue their self-interest both economically and socially. You've got to control them. Stability of social structures is absolutely vital. You don't change things unless you absolutely have to. Third, law and order is an important stress in conservatism because, again, the rules, following the rules, obeying the rules, being punished if you break the rules is an important way to keep order. Customs and traditions are an important way to keep people behaving in ways that don't break the law and that preserves order. Inequality under conservatism generally is not a concern, in part because of this self-restraint concept that's so dominant in classical conservatism, and that those who have the resources to do so have an obligation to care about the good of everybody. And so charity is an important element of conservatism. There's a term called noblesse oblige, to the obligation of the nobility. And if you think about the Bush family, not the recent generations, but the first President Bush and then his father and then their father, old money, very wealthy, very obligated to sort of be involved in helping their community. And actually, for those of you from older towns in the Northeast, particularly New England, if you go into an old town, you have the center of the town, and then you'll see sort of gradually the perimeter where you have the old wealthy, large Victorian houses that are probably now multifamily houses. And then as you go a little further out, the houses get a little smaller and smaller. The poor and the wealthy actually live pretty close to each other. And that was true in Great Britain as well. And so classical conservatism has that, you have to maintain order. Change is not a good thing to classical conservatism. Well, let's go now and look at modern conservatism. There's still an emphasis on order. Robert Bork, the excerpt that you read, here the quote there, there are aspects of almost every branch of our culture that are worse than ever before, and that rot is spreading. Essentially, what he's saying is we are rotting out as a society, and because of our culture. And he wrote an entire book outlining where he believes the United States is headed to disaster. And he predicted that we will end our period of being a great country unless we restore the old order of conservatism. The second sort of excerpt, it comes from Irving Kristol, who's a little more international in his focus, and he basically said, you need an assertive government. So classical conservatism basically said, you need government to keep restraint down and to keep order. Well, Kristol actually sort of advocates a more assertive position, particularly in international affairs, to promote our values around the world. So there's still an emphasis on values and culture, but modern conservatism sort of emphasizes both of those things and a few other things that makes it pretty distinctive. Let's look at modern conservative presuppositions. First, traditional values are the glue that holds society together. Not all that different. Society must be preserved. Again, very similar to classical conservatives. Government must protect morality. Not all that different. A little more emphasis on sort of the protection of morality and official government sanctioning of behavior. Here's the next thing. Collective actions are to be suspected. Whenever there are unions or whenever government has programs that give financial assistance, those things are probably interfering with the natural order of the world. And then finally, there's an obligation to promote our basic values abroad as well as internally, and to protect our allies from our enemy. So since this sounds very similar to classical conservatism, let's look at the role of government, which is where the distinction starts to come. Modern conservatives basically say you have to regulate social behavior, and you have to do it through government action. And so, unlike classical conservatives who were always reluctant to use governmental power, modern conservatives see it as a linchpin. So modern conservatives actually are in favor of big government when it comes to preserving social order. On the other hand, they want deregulation, and this is where modern conservatism is most distinct from classical conservatism. Classical conservatism is premised on the notion that what you have to do is you have to sort of have this balance between freedom and order, which means free markets are not always a good thing. Modern conservatism thinks free markets are always a good thing. Deregulation, getting government out of the role of sort of telling businesses what they can and can't do or how they can and can't do things, is an important element of modern conservatism, very different. Outsourcing of services, meaning there are private approaches to solving problems are assumed to always be better than public. And so the role of government in providing social services should be outsourced, because the private sector or the nonprofit sector can do that better. And then finally, a really big difference is realism in foreign policy. Realism is a term we'll get to in a week or two, maybe next week, that where you fight your main foes of order and preserve freedom abroad, because you have as much threat abroad as you do domestic, and so you have to be much more assertive. Let's look more clearly now at the distinctions between classical at the distinctions here between classical and modern. The first distinction between the classical and modern is the importance of the status quo. For classical conservatives, it's a central idea that status quo is maintained. Even if the status quo is not something you would necessarily like, the alternative is not necessarily better. Oakeshott wrote about that. In modern conservatism, status quo is unimportant. In fact, modern conservatives often feel you have to be a little more radical to restore a prior order and get rid of what we currently have, because what we currently have is problematic. So there's a much less deep concern for change. Modern conservatives want to change. They want to change back to an era prior to the current one. The second, of course, is the role of government. In classical conservatism, it's very restrained, only there to protect order and to assure that everything stays stable. Modern conservatism, no. They believe in activist government, that you have to be an active government to regulate social behavior, and you also need an active government on foreign policy. The third big change and distinction is the pace of change. Classical conservatives always assume that change is best when it's slow. Modern conservatives think change is best when it's faster. You got to do it now. And then again, as I mentioned, the role of international affairs. Classical is isolationist, modern is interventionist. So, to conclude this presentation, I pulled up the chart and I added modern conservatism. And so if you see down in toward the middle is the New Deal. A little higher up were the Republicans who had the policies of normalcy in the 20s. Modern conservatives are a little further up in the blue box. If you, again, using the diagram, the higher means that they believe more that government regulation of social behavior is important. But since they're over a little further to the right, that means government intervention in the markets is much less important and actually much less desirable. So I hope that this has helped, and I hope that this actually works this time. So see you soon.